I'm Dan Shear. I volunteer at the Historical Society in Lawrence County. I grew up in Lawrenceville, graduated from Lawrenceville Township High School in 1969 and University of Illinois in 73. So I'm retired now and working with the Historical Society.
All right, all right. I'm John M. King. I'm from East Lucan Township. Graduated from Bridgeport High School in 1965, University of Illinois in 1969. Spent some time in the Air Force. Been farming since Christmas in 1976. I'm an active member of the Lawrence County Historical Society, and we are in the midst of trying to identify every Civil War soldier identified with Lawrence County, Illinois. Of that, there are two guys from my neighborhood that I have become interested in. One is my neighbor George Clark, who died at Missionary Ridge in November of 1863, and his good friend Victor H. Gould, who was an elder of my Pisgah Presbyterian Church, and I'm an elder there now. And Victor Gould was at the side of George Clark when he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Missionary Ridge, and then Victor Gould wrote the nicest letter to Mr. and Mrs. George Washington Clark about the death of their son. And you have a copy of that letter, and it's two young men from the same neighborhood. And that becomes more interesting to me because these are folks that I know.
It started out originally with the Adjutant General's books. The Adjutant General keeps record of everything. And they went to find anybody that was enlisted, inducted from Lawrence County. And that's the original. And then we've found several other ways to identify these people.
This letter that Victor H. Gould wrote is in the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield. For some reason, Mike Neal, local attorney and president of the Lawrence County Historical Society, discovered this letter, got a copy of it, and then we've been able to transcribe it and share it with you.
Dear friends, it now becomes absolutely necessary for one to write you a letter in which I have said ye very sad news indeed to tell you. On the 25th of November last, we were called on to perform our duties on the bloody battlefield of Mission Ridge near Chattanooga. At 9:00 a.m., the battle opened and was quite severe, in which many of our brave fell wounded in the field. At 12:00 p.m., George, your son, fell mortally wounded. He was struck with a shell, tearing his body most desperately and also tearing both legs almost entirely off. He lived 1 hour and then quietly fell asleep, leaving many true and loving, and I trust Christian friends to mourn his loss. In the morning before going into the engagement, he took from his pocket the precious volume which he brought from home and which he always carried wherever duty called him, and quietly read a few chapters, which seemed to have a deep impression on his mind, and I trust had its desired effect. He seemed quite serious during the engagement until he was struck by the fatal ball. His dying request I send you, but with serious and tender feelings do I attempt to write it. Been reading in the morning and gave it to me, requesting me to send it to Martha as his dying gift. After which he offered a short prayer to God, our blessed Savior and Redeemer. Then he fell asleep. I was not permitted to take him off of the field to bury his remains, for the battle was raging and becoming quite desperate on the left and also in our front, in which we lost a number of brave men. The battle lasted 7 hours, and night coming on, we retired back on our side for the night. Our dead lay on the field until the coming day. They were buried. I was not permitted to visit the field, as we had to march in pursuit of the retreating enemy, who evacuated their works the night after the battle, and was now leaving for Atlanta. After pursuing the enemy for some 3 weeks, we returned to Chattanooga and camped one field. I found the grave of my slain comrade. It caused me to feel solemn as I looked upon the grave of our departed friend. He now fills an honorable grave, even the grave of a true and legal soldier. As you are left to weep and mourn his loss, I also weep with you and pray God, our divine Master, that he will grant you sustaining grace to support you under the afflicting dispensation of his providence, and that you may at least meet your departed one in heaven, where there will be no more suffering, no more pain, no more sore trials, and no more parting. The shining theme of Jehovah and kind associations among his saints forever and ever is the prayer of your friend and fellow comrade of your departed son. Send George's testament as soon as I have an opportunity of so doing. George had $4 in money, which the captain will send you as everything falls into his hand to settle up. He requested me to write to you and tell you he will write to you in a few days, which I trust he will do. We will leave this place in a few days for Huntsville, Allah. Dear friends, I must close my poorly composed letter. You have the prayers of every Christian soldier. John Hershey joins in sending love to you and all the family. Please give my love to Father's family and tell them I am well. Please some of the family write immediately to me and inform me whether my letter was duly received.
Well, Victor H. Gould, the son of Aaron Gould and Eliza Buchanan. He grew up in the Pisgah Presbyterian Church. His father, both parents were very active in the Pisgah Presbyterian Church. Aaron Gould was not a charter member, but he joined within a few days of the formation of the congregation in 1835. Victor's mother, Eliza Buchanan Gould, was the daughter of Elder Thomas Buchanan, who was very instrumental in forming the church. And Victor Gould was the nephew of the first minister of the church, Reverend Isaac Bennett. And the church was very anti-slavery in their beliefs early on. We have Thomas Buchanan was very ardent in his beliefs. We have a resolution in 1837, in the fall of 1837, at a Presbyterian meeting in Charleston, 7 people attending, and one of the signatures on this resolution was Elder Thomas Buchanan, and it was condemning the institution of slavery, and that no person that owned a slave should be allowed to have communion in the church. And they ordered this to be published in the Alton Observer, except that it didn't get published because the Reverend Elijah Lovejoy was murdered at Alton, Illinois, and his press dumped into the Mississippi River. And so the things that led to the Civil War, the politics involved, the feelings involved, were becoming very intense for the 30 years preceding the war. And so Victor H. Gould and his family, Victor H. Gould would have grown up hearing sermons condemning the institution of slavery. He would have been at family meals that they would have talked about how the slavery was evil. So when it came time for him to join the Union Army, I'm sure that he and his brother did not hesitate to join. Victor H. Gould had 2 brothers in the Civil War. One fought, Thomas Gould fought in the 11th Missouri Infantry, and his brother Andrew Gould was in the same company, H of the 26th Illinois.
I was always interested in the Civil War stuff since I was a little kid. My uncle had an old Civil War musket that was his granddad's, and I'd go up there and look at that old thing. I never could get it, but I was always interested in it. I rebuilt it for him, and I shot it a lot of times and everything, but it's down in Florida now. It got passed on down the family. So that's an old Belgian gun. I think it's 69 or 70 caliber. You can look at it if you want.
Thank you.
There's what it shoots.
Thank you. Oh wow, it's heavy.
That's a 69 caliber round ball. If you got hit with that, you're in bad shape. That's why they wouldn't too many of the soldiers lived very long after they got shot. That will just break your, if you got hit in the army, it'll break your arm, just shatter it, just make pieces out of it. If you didn't bleed to death before they got to the doctor would cut your arm off. That's the only thing they had for it.
So how'd you
And 3 days later, you died of gangrene usually.
acquire all these weapons here?
I made it my business to find them. This is an 1838 Harper's Ferry. Now this is also is a flint conversion. That was made in 1838. See, that was an old gun when the Civil War started. This is one of the Norse guns here. This is a pattern of 1863, but it's a contract musket. Springfield Armory never made this gun. It was made by LG&Y, which is Lampkin, Goodnow, and Yale. They was a government contractor, and they made all kinds of eating utensils. They made canteens, cookware, and everything like that for the Army. But this is the standard rifle of the Civil War, what the North used. This here is an 1852 Harper's Ferry. That's a smooth bore. It's 58 caliber. That comes from Glasgow, Kentucky. More than likely it was Confederate. This is a British Enfield. The government bought gobs of these for the Army because they're the same caliber as our musket, same size and everything, and actually they're a little better musket. See, this is all brass mounted. It has brass butt plate, brass trigger guard, and it's the same size bore as ours, and they were a real good musket in their day. This one was made in 1862.
You can get a whole list of different rifles and pistols. That there was a lot. They didn't have any coordination as to what was available. They took what was available. Now the regular soldier's life was outdoors. Very seldom did they even get to sleep in a building. And they would be marching through the mud, living out in a day like this when it's 30 or 40 degrees. They'd be marching through the mud for maybe 20 miles. There's a regiment at Gettysburg that marched 20 or 25 miles and went right into line after doing all that. And that's a tough life. It's a wonder any of them survived, really. They didn't. The hospitals were tents or old buildings. They didn't have good conditions. The doctors were not really trained very much, and they carried what they needed on their back, and they ate stuff that we wouldn't eat now, but they had to survive.
One of the interesting stories out of my neighborhood, there are many sharpshooters, members of the Company I of the 66th Illinois. They were formed as the Western Sharpshooters. They started out with Springfield muskets, or with good sharpshooting rifles. They weren't Springfields, but they were allowed to buy Henry repeating rifles. And because they could get many shots off, that was their weapon of choice. They bought these out of their personal funds, and they could bring those home with them. So there are a few of those around. Yeah.
And that made a huge difference, because with the repeating rifle you could shoot several shots one after another. With the older ones, the muzzle loading would take 30, 45 seconds, and if you were under fire, these guys would get nervous. Sometimes they would put 3 or 4 slugs in, shoot it, and the thing would blow up. But when they got the repeating rifle, it was just a shell, and they could shoot a lot faster than the Confederates.
We had local soldiers that got to buy Spencer repeating rifles. Colonel Eli Lilly of Indianapolis would finance this, and then they could pay him back a little bit at a time. But there was a charge against the Union line, and the Confederates fired, and they fired back, and the Confederate line was completely surprised when they kept firing. So they said of these rifles that they could load them in the morning and they could fire all day, but the Confederate line quickly fell because of superior firepower. Our emphasis has been mostly on the soldiers themselves. rather than on battles and on tactics or major marches. Now, we have learned a lot about different things, but our emphasis has been on the local men themselves, who they were, what they did, whether they were wounded or came home sick. So many of these men would get camp disease, was more casualties because of disease they picked up in camp. And their health could be broken for the rest of their lives. And that was more likely to happen than to be wounded or to be killed on the battlefield. But sad stories all over. We had local men that were blowing up on the Sultana. We had local men that were blowing up when the General Lyons exploded off North Carolina. Our Lawrence County men were all over and experienced it all.
A lot of these groups of people, like in their area, would enlist at the same time. They would have kind of what I call a recruitment party or a big festival or something, maybe up on the square at Lawrenceville or over at Bridgeport or somewhere, because Bridgeport was not that close to Lawrenceville in those traveling days. It took a lot longer. So, but they would get a big, maybe bring in a little band or something and have a thing and talk these guys into enlisting. And a lot of them ended up in the same company of the same regiment. Often brothers were. And that system lasted, it was done by World War II. I don't know about World War I, but they wouldn't put brothers in the same unit because of the Civil War, because Mom would get word that 3 of her sons died all together. So it was a tough time. We had soldiers in the Illinois cavalry. A lot of them had to bring their own horses and equipment. Sometimes they had to bring their own guns for a while before they armed. Some of the companies were referred to as dismounted cavalry because not all of them had horses. They had a group of infantry people with the cavalry units.
We have a few men who were members of the Mississippi Marine Brigade. Wounded soldiers recuperating in St. Louis, and they would, if they were expected to recover, they would be made members of the Mississippi Marine Brigade. And fast boats that could be dispatched, either infantry or cavalry units, a fast boat would deliver them, they'd do their mission, get back on the boat, and go away. It sounded good that they did not have to march.
A lot of those, yeah, they'd already been wounded or ill. They were in hospitals and serving on a boat in the Mississippi or some river close. Sounded pretty good to them. They did see a lot of action. Was referred to as Mr. Lincoln's Brown Water Navy because they were in the Mississippi, the Ohio, all the tributaries, instead of out on the ocean where a regular Navy ship would be.